My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. Astonishing neuroscientific evidence reveals human brains may be hardwired to feel at peace and tranquil in nature. Conversely, human brains may be struggling to keep up with the ever-rapidly changing urban environments, which lead to harmful behaviors such as confusion and angst. The implications for these findings are unsettling, given how rapidly unnatural environments are enveloping us every day. Our brains may actually be signaling danger. These studies are profoundly significant because whereas nature highlights beneficial aspects of our neurobiology, urban environments are stealing our sense of peace, attention, belonging, and may be fueling a life of unease, whether we are aware of it or not. In this episode, we will be speaking with Dr. Ian Frampton, an Exeter University psychologist, about these significant findings and what we can do to safeguard our mental health and preserve nature at the same time. So join us on another Wild Roots journey to understanding our place within the natural world.
My name's Ian Frampton. I'm a clinical psychologist and I live and work in Cornwall, which is in the far southwest of the United Kingdom. And my background is, so as a clinical psychologist, I work with children and adolescents with a range of physical health difficulties that have psychological impact on them. So that might be kids who are undergoing treatment for cancer, or kids with disability, or my specialist area clinically is supporting children with eating disorders and their families. So quite a wide range of situations where children are facing additional challenges as part of their development because of physical illness and the psychological component of that. So as a clinician working in that area, I just got interested in maybe what some of the benefits of the environment more generally just could be just generally for kids growing up. So we know that there's a lot of evidence out there now that kids growing up in urban environments face additional challenges. And I was kind of interested in looking at that the other way around and saying, what is it about rural environments or natural environments that might actually be protective for all children, and then specifically for children who are facing additional challenges because of their their illness or their long-term disability. For me, I guess working with kids who face additional challenges, I was interested in how the natural environment could be beneficial for all children growing up and living where we do in Cornwall in the far southwest of the United Kingdom. So if you look at a map of the United Kingdom, we're the kind of pointy bit that points down in the southwest in towards the Atlantic Ocean, and we're surrounded by sea. So we have beautiful beaches and rocky coastlines and lots of green space. So where I work at the General Hospital in Truro, which is our major city, even though it's quite a small city. There's only 500,000 people who live in the entire county of Cornwall. So our local hospital, we have great partnerships with our local medical school. And the medical school had been able to attract some funding from the European community to develop a centre, so the European Centre for Environment and Human Health. And that research centre is really focused on looking at what are the benefits of the natural environment for human health across the whole lifespan. And so I was interested specifically in my question, which was about how the natural environment could be helpful for children and adolescents, and how living in that environment could be beneficial for them.
There's a lot of books out there that talk about this kind of natural effect, or this green effect. We have The Lost Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, who talks about this. And we also have books like Blue Mind, who talk about the benefit of living near blue spaces or water. And it's very nice to have some actual science behind this, because for perhaps maybe you and I, and as well as many of my listeners, it may seem very evident that being surrounded by nature and experiencing nature is beneficial. But the interesting aspect for me is how the science is showing what we already know is true.
Exactly. And we know it's true, right? It intuitively, it feels like these environments, there's something about these natural environments that as humans, we kind of, we just feel that there's something intrinsic in these environments that make them beneficial in all sorts of ways. And as you suggest, there's quite a lot of research out there now, large scale studies as well as smaller experimental studies, that are trying to work out what is it about these natural environments that make them somehow beneficial for human health. So a good example of that, I guess, is we know that green is a color that is beneficial for human health, right? So in the theatre, the backstage room where the performers wait, the actors wait before they go onto stage, is called the green room. And it's been known for centuries that green is a color that just it's something about the color green that helps humans to feel safe and feel comfortable. That's been a tradition in the theatre and in other kind of settings where if you want someone to feel comfortable, put them in a green space. Now the question is, what is it about that green space that confers those sorts of benefits? And it's only recently that the imaging technologies or the research technologies have started to be developed that can help us really understand what's going on in the brain. So our research group, and I really have to credit our fantastic PhD students and master students and postdocs who did all the work. I can't take any credit for any of these studies that I'm talking about. My job is mainly to make the tea and make sure everyone's happy, and let these incredibly bright and able young people get on and do their work. So they should definitely take all the credit for this. But what the students have been doing is trying to pose a series of questions about what are the psychological mechanisms that might underlie some of the advantages. So we could talk about what we know about the advantages, and then what the mechanisms might be, I guess. You've already mentioned the whole body of work on the green environment and the blue environment. So we talk a lot about the blue gym, and being where we are in the far southwest, we're very interested in how the coastal environment may confer additional benefits. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what's specific about the Blue Mind, but for our research group, I guess we've been looking both at green space, so rural environments, and blue space, and therefore coastal environments. So let's get on to what we know about the green space. And there's a lot of studies out there now suggesting that being in green space makes you feel better. So if we measure mood and ask kids and adults about how they feel, they will report enhanced mood. They'll feel better when in a green space compared to being in an urban space. That's been very well established. Also, there's quite a lot of evidence out there that being in a green space does something helpful to attention. And attention is such an important, psychological construct, particularly for children, right? So when kids are in school, their ability to sustain their attention, or more importantly, even to restore their attention. So this idea of attention restoration. So we know that some environments will deplete your attentional capacity, and some environments will restore your attentional capacity. And I'm sure it won't surprise you or your listeners to know that urban environments, busy, noisy, complex urban environments, have a pretty negative effect on attention, especially for children. Right, so living in, moving through, being in a busy urban environment depletes children's attention, and that has obviously educational impact in terms of their ability to study and benefit from being in school. And particularly kids with ADHD, it's even worse for them. Right, so if you have difficulty sustaining your attention anyway because you have an attention deficit, then an urban environment will make that even worse.
Right.
So the other side of that coin is if we then can introduce a green environment, a rural environment, that has been shown by a whole series of really elegant studies to restore attention, to actually enhance attentional capacity for children, which is obviously good educationally, and it's just a good thing. As well as enhancing their mood, it kind of gets them ready to learn and gets them into a good space. So our studies were to try and work out what it was about those environments that was operating to either deplete or restore attention capacity. And the way we did that was we borrowed one of the MRI scanners, the magnetic resonance imaging scanners, one of the brain scanners from the hospital, and got some scanner time. And we actually worked young adult students, because although we're primarily interested in younger children, as you can imagine from a research perspective, it's complicated to really get younger kids into the scanner because it's a noisy environment and they have to lie there still on period of time, right? So it's just difficult. We have done some studies with kids, but the study I'm talking about was actually a study conducted with undergraduate students in the scanner. And what we did was we basically, fairly straightforward design for the study. We showed a group of participants images, and some of these images were rural images and some were urban images. And then we basically captured the brain activity associated with the times when they were looking at an urban image and the time they were looking at a rural image. So what do we find? Well, the first take-home message we found was that when we showed the students urban images, their brains got really busy. Their brains, particularly the visual parts of their brain that are trying to interpret visual information, kind of go into overdrive. Lots of
overstimulation.
Exactly. We're just trying to we think that what's going on is the brain is just trying to make sense of what is it in this environment. What is this environment? Because the edges, the kind of the contrast, the way that the buildings work, just the visual complexity of the environment makes the brain work really hard to try and work out what's going on. And that uses up a lot of attentional capacity, just trying to work out what's going on. Conversely, if we looked at the brain activity associated with the rural images, something completely different happens in the brain. What happens is the brain goes into this kind of calm, quiet mode, which we call the default mode. And this is a mode of brain activity where the brain is just kind of waiting and it's in a kind of calm place. It's a part of the brain that's associated with mindfulness meditation. Exactly. Interesting, right? So it's a kind of, it's a part of the brain called the limbic system, which is our sort of more mammalian brain. So we have our kind of human neocortex, which is where we process language and higher level thinking and decision making. And then we have the limbic system, which is the kind of the monkey brain, the mammalian brain, sitting beneath that, which processes more kind of fundamental emotional responses to stimuli. And so the default mode network is just kind of signaling that the brain is kind of sees this environment as familiar and non-threatening and can therefore go into this kind of meditative, contemplative state and therefore restore attentional capacity.
So the evidence is telling us without a doubt natural environments are good for us.
Right. because our brain, as it's evolved over all those generations, has learned that these natural environments are kind of familiar and safe and restful, and that's where the green bit comes in, right? So the greenness of it seems to be important. There's a blueness thing as well, which we'll come on to in a minute. But essentially, when we're looking at green environment, then the brain just goes, okay, I recognize this. This is a familiar place. You don't need to panic. You can just, you don't have to switch on lots of attentional mechanisms. You don't have to kind of do lots of visual processing of the environment. You kind of, it says to you, it says, I know what this is. This is an okay place to be.
Familiar too, evolutionarily.
Exactly. And so that basically puts the brain in this default mode and frees up restoring capacity and attention, so that then when the next challenge comes along, you're kind of in a good place to respond to it. And that's obviously in contrast to the urban environment, which does exactly the opposite. It fires up what's called the central executive network, which is this more neocortical new brain network that's trying to deal with new problems that it can't respond to in some sort of instinctive way. It has to say, I don't know what this environment is. I don't know how to respond in this environment. So I have to switch on all these attentional mechanisms to maybe deal with threats in this environment that I don't know. Now, I mean, that kind of makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? It sounds like it's kind of, it's like, a lot of good science. When you hear it, it's like, well, that's obvious. But what's good about these studies that my colleagues and students conducted was that here's the evidence that actually there are differential brain responses to these different kinds of environments. And so that there is actually something going on, that we can detect something using these kind of novel imaging techniques. A couple of things about that. One of the things that then, when we started talking about the findings, people said, well, it's obvious in a way because the rural environment is so much prettier than the urban environment.
Yeah, I was going to point that out, is that it was made very clear in the article. You didn't just use sort of these perfect images of rural environments. You used a wide range of natural images.
Right. So we did a couple of things. First of all, we found kind of boring rural images, that weren't necessarily attractive. So we weren't all about the kind of picture postcard rural environments. We found some fairly sort of dull rural environments, and then we found some very elegant urban environments. Some of those, some photographs looking at very interesting ways of presenting contemporary buildings or whatever. And then we got a load of people to rate the attractiveness of the images. They didn't know what the study was about, so we just said, just tell how attractive you think this image is, and then so we could take account of this sort of overall average attractiveness rating of each of the images, and we found actually that didn't account for it. So it wasn't just like the rural images were that much more attractive. So even when we account for that, we managed to find an effect.
I think that's really important. Basically, what we're saying. Yeah. Basically, what we're saying here is that even though humans may appear to be adjusted to urbanization and urban environments, evolutionarily, our brains haven't caught up to a more natural response to these environments. We're just not there yet.
From an evolutionary perspective, it's only been 3 generations, 4 generations, 5 generations, right, that we've lived in those urban environments. And of course, those urban environments have been developing rapidly throughout the last 150 years. So you're right. In evolutionary terms, that's nothing. That's no time at all for the human brain to work that out. So both. So it's not simply that urban environments are ugly and natural environments are somehow aesthetically more pleasing. There's something more fundamental about how our brains respond. And the next thing we did was then, in another study, one of our students had this brilliant idea, which was to take the images and take each pixel and just randomly spray the pixels out over the size of the image. Wow. So it had exactly the same visual information in terms of the colors and the overall characteristics of the images, but now they were just like completely like modern art kind of splodgy stuff, right? So it's got the same basic information but just randomly presented. And what she showed was she got exactly the same effect.
Wow.
Even when you take a kind of an urban environment that's been completely kind of mangled into random patterns containing the same pixels and compared it with rural environments that contained rural information but randomly presented, we still found this difference. So there's something
about the actual cool.
Right? Isn't that cool?
That is amazing.
Yeah, right. So something fun, and that suggests it is a fundamental early visual process. So there's something about how the brain in the occipital lobe, in the back of our brain, starts to very early visual processing and starts to kind of make sense of what we're seeing. And starts to make decisions about, is this an environment that I need to kind of switch on because there's potential risk or uncertainty in this environment, or is this an environment that I can relax in and restore my attention?
That is just incredible.
Yes.
So you work with Professor Michael DePlege, who was also cited in that article, and he said something incredibly striking to me. He said that essentially urban dwellers could be suffering in much the same way as animals kept in captivity.
Yes.
And when he said this, I was so thankful that he laid it out in that way. Because as we all know, more people have moved to the city and to urban environments, there has been an incredible rise in depression and abnormal behaviors in society. I have always felt like I'm someone who's maybe a bit hypersensitive or hyper aware of the unnaturalness in my environment. So I do often find urban environments unbearable, which is partly why I always say I would never move back to any large city. And I think most people would find where I live today very calm and quiet. But I still sometimes feel that deep frustration when I hear, for instance, certain noises, like a very loud truck engine that's driving by. And when I recognize these sort of unnatural things in my environment, I get these mixed feelings of angst, frustration, and rage seemingly all at once. And it's very much a feeling like wanting to run away.
Right. And what Professor DePlege is saying there is that, looking at a whole range of studies that the European Centre have conducted, is that your experience is exactly that, that we find in the large scale studies. And maybe it's something about how those feelings are signaling to you is there's a potential threat in this environment. There's something in this environment that's unnatural, because by definition, hearing a jet aircraft is unnatural, right? So even if you live on the flight path, you're still going to experience that noise as something that's alien to the part of the brain that wasn't kind of built to hear those kind of sounds. Now that kind of idea has, I think, really important implications for obviously urban design, for how we build, because not everyone can live in a beautiful rural location, right? We just, human habitation doesn't allow that. So some people have to live in cities for all sorts of reasons, and kids have to grow up in cities. So it does say something about how the built environment is constructed, city planning, architecture. And it's kind of stuff that in our country and the US as well, that Victorians knew this, right? And any urban planner historically would build parks and green space. And so I was in London yesterday, and I'm just walking through the city. It was all getting a bit much, so I just took a detour through the park, and it just made me feel better, right? And so we can do stuff like that. What we also found was in another study, so this is my colleague Rebecca Jenkin, for her PhD studies, she conducted a whole range of elegant studies with school kids, trying to find were there ways of helping the kids restore their attentional capacity and get back to a kind of readiness to learning. Now, just because of the complexities of research, we couldn't actually take the kids out onto the beach. When we did some other studies, but these were kids already in school. And she was wondering whether there was something that could happen in an everyday school setting that would just help the kids to restore their attention and kind of restore their mood, to make them more ready to learn, more available to learn. So she did a very simple but elegant study where she got them to look at a video monitor. So it wasn't a whole scanning study, it was just a video monitor. And she showed them a 3-minute video, and they were either watching a rural scene or an urban scene, or just like the screensaver, some kind of animated screensaver. And what she showed was, even after 3 minutes, the kids who'd been watching the rural scene had significantly better attention. It had restored their attention. So if we could just build that in somehow, like just having maybe just green sort of forest screensavers, or having forest scenes or rural scenes in but around the school environment, something about just having access to those kind of images just help the kids. And what she found was, it wasn't actually so much that the rural scenes were kind of enhancing the kids' attention. It was that the rest of their world was just depleting their attention. So they were
Exactly.
and their attentional capacity had been kind of just sort of used up by the complexity of the world that they were having to live in visually, and as you said, but also the auditory world and all of that. And so by offering them this kind of space to reconnect with those kind of rural scenes and disconnect from the kind of modern environment, even for 3 minutes, it restored their attentional capacity back to a kind of optimum level to make them ready to learn.
So we know this intuitively, but I wish people would understand and embrace the science for as significant as it really is for humanity to be able to get along, be productive, be the social creatures that we are. I feel like it is so paramount that we incorporate these findings into our development. If we neglect this natural relationship that we have with the natural world around us, and continue and don't see ourselves or see our surroundings as our habitat, we begin to change the way we think about everything and everyone we interact with.
Exactly.
And again, Professor DePledge mentioned that it's a lot like the environment in zoos. If you don't get the environmental conditions just right, the animals start behaving in a very wacky sort of way. And this is what may be happening to us presently.
Right.
As we continue to fail and nurture that natural relationship we have with our habitat. It's like the alarm bell, and we know what is happening. The science tells us this, so let's do something about it.
Sure, exactly. And I think obviously the challenge at a kind of whole society level is how we kind of build in this way of thinking into urban design and housing design and how we live, right? Because with population growth and urbanization, of course, and climate change and all those factors, then we can't, it's not like we can go back to some kind of agrarian kind of utopia where everybody gets to live in a field. Partly because it turns out that historically that wasn't so much of a utopia either, because there were diseases and life expectancy and so on. So it's not like it's some kind of call to return to this kind of agrarian utopia. But on the other hand, there are some fairly straightforward things that can make a massive difference. So I'm thinking of things like forest school, really popular in Europe and I guess in the US as well, in terms of even for urban dwelling kids, giving them access to green environments. And that could be a park. It doesn't have to be a massively rural environment, but allowing them to get out into those green environments, out to nature, and building that into the school curriculum.
So, we can recognize where we can integrate these natural elements in our environment, in our surroundings, to allow our brains to function more naturally and healthfully and smoothly. It certainly seems like an easy thing to accomplish. It really doesn't seem all that difficult.
Right, exactly.
But as you say, there isn't a silver bullet, and we're certainly not all going to become ruralized.
Yeah, exactly. And things like urban parks, just maybe just covering one block, or even a park, just having that access, or even in the schoolyard, the number of schoolyards, or playgrounds that just are sort of kind of sterile concrete,
awful,
right? Yeah, and don't have any, and you wouldn't be a massive amount of work to basically re-engineer that environment to use some green into that space.
Dr. Ian Frampton, thank you so much for sharing your incredible research with us. I would love to know if you have any mental health advice for our listeners today.
A nice place to start is choose your screensaver carefully. And on your laptop or on your computer at home or at work, if you can find an image, a kind of a screensaver that has a rural environment, some kind of green environment that kind of has a sense of quality or beauty about it, just having that as your screensaver and just looking at it, I think it's surprising. What we learned from the research was how much the benefit of that, just looking at it for a couple of minutes whilst you're thinking about stuff. That's actually quite a powerful way of restoring your attention and improving your mood.
And in closing, would you be able to share perhaps a special story of a connection you have made in nature or with an animal?
I think my special connection with nature comes from living in Cornwall in this beautiful rural environment. And when my son was born, I just felt compelled to just go to the beach and just look out over the ocean and just connect with this joy of his safe arrival and somehow celebrate that his arrival in the world. And this felt like the right place to do it. Just something about that was something profound about that environment. So that's my story.
For many, these findings may not be surprising at all. As Ian stated, intuitively we know this to be true. The evidence is apparent. But now, we need to recognize the significance behind these findings and realize that our true humanity, the human animals that make us up, cannot thrive without recognizing our relationship to nature. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.